there is a moment, and if it has not yet come for you, it will. When the person who has spent their whole life absorbing the pain of others finally stops crying, stops explaining, stops reaching for the hand that keeps slapping them away, and simply watches. No tears, no pleading, just two eyes, calm as still water, studying the one who broke them, the way a physician studies a wound that is no longer his own. And in that silence something ancient stirs, something the empath did not choose and cannot fully explain. This is not revenge. This is the shadow, awakening. I want to speak to you today about that moment, about what happens in the depths of a gentle soul when it finally turns the mirror back on its tormentor, not to destroy them, but to survive. And I want to tell you why this moment, terrifying as it feels, may be the most important psychological event of your entire life. Let us begin honestly, without the comforting fictions we tell each other in polite company. The empath does not fall in love with the narcissist by accident. There is no such thing as accident in the life of the soul, only pattern, only the unlived parts of us searching blindly for their reflection. The empath is drawn again and again to the wound dressed as wonder, the charm, the intensity, the feeling in the first weeks of being finally seen. And the narcissist, for his part, senses in the empath exactly what he lacks and cannot generate within himself: warmth, depth, the capacity to feel without collapsing. He does not love this, he feeds on it, and so begins the oldest transaction in the human psyche, one soul offering its light freely, the other consuming it as though it were owed. For a long while, the empath does not see this exchange for what it is. She calls it devotion, she calls it patience, she calls it love, though it has stopped resembling love months ago and now resembles something closer to servitude. This is not stupidity. I want to be very clear about that, because the world is cruel enough to call such people foolish. It is not foolishness. It is a wound speaking the only language it has ever known. If I give enough, I will finally be enough. And the narcissist, whether consciously or not, learns precisely which lever to pull to keep that wound open, keep it hungry, keep it useful. The tactics are not complicated, though they are devastating in their consistency. Idealization first, the flooding of attention, the mirroring of the empath's own values and dreams back at her until she believes she has found her twin soul. Then, slowly, the devaluation, the silences that appear from nowhere, the affection that must now be earned, the comparisons to others, the subtle rewriting of memory, until the empath no longer trusts her own recollection of what was said, what was promised, what was done. Then the discard, or the threat of it, dangled like a blade to keep her compliant. And when she finally moves to leave, the hoovering begins. The sudden remorse, the tears that arrive precisely when they are needed, the return of the golden mask that was worn in the very beginning. This is not chaos. This is architecture. It has a design, and the design exists for one purpose only: control. I have spent my life studying what lies beneath human behavior, and I can tell you this: the narcissist is not evil in the way children's stories imagine evil, with horns and delight in cruelty. He is starving. Somewhere in his own history, a self was never permitted to form. A child was praised only for performance, or was neglected so completely that grandiosity became the only shield against annihilation, or was so smothered by a parent's own unmet needs that no boundary between self and other ever solidified. He built out of necessity a magnificent persona, and behind that persona there is almost nothing. No felt sense of worth that does not depend on another's admiration. No internal compass, only appetite and the terror of being exposed as empty. This does not excuse what he does to you. Understanding is not absolution, but it matters because it explains why he cannot simply stop, why apology never changes behavior, why insight into your pain does not translate into remorse. He is not withholding empathy out of malice alone. In many cases, he genuinely does not possess the internal machinery to generate it. You have been begging a man born without the organ of remorse to feel remorse. This is the tragedy underneath the tragedy. So what then happens when the empath, exhausted, hollowed, finally done, decides to stop begging and start studying? What happens when she takes the very tools that were used against her? The silence, the withdrawal, the calculated withholding of emotion, the refusal to explain herself, the strategic unavailability, and turns them back on the one who taught her their power. This is the question I want to sit with you in today, because something extraordinary happens, and it is not what either side expects. Understand first what the narcissist depends upon. He does not run on love, though he will use that word constantly. He runs on supply, attention, reaction, emotional charge. Whether that charge is adoring or furious matters far less than you would think, because both keep him fed. Anger proves he still has power over you. Tears prove the same. Even hatred, directed at him with full force, is still contact, and contact is what he requires, the way the body requires oxygen. What he cannot survive, what genuinely starves the mechanism at his center, is indifference, not performed indifference, which he will sniff out in an instant, being a lifelong expert in performance himself. Real indifference, the kind that comes only after the empath has done the interior work of no longer needing anything from him at all. And here is where the transformation becomes dangerous, and where I must speak carefully, because there are two roads that open before the empath in this moment, and they lead to entirely different destinations. The first road is this: the empath, in her exhaustion and fury, begins to mimic the narcissist. She learns to withhold affection as punishment. She learns to manufacture jealousy the way he once did. She learns to lie a little, to keep secrets as leverage, let silence do the cruel work that words once did to her. And for a while, I will not lie to you, it works. The narcissist, suddenly facing a version of his own weapon, becomes destabilized. He chases, he panics, he performs the very anxiety he once inflicted so casually on her. There is a fierce, bitter satisfaction in this. It can feel, for a season, like justice, but watch closely what is happening in the empath's own interior world while this is unfolding. Because every time she reaches for his tactics instead of her own nature, she is not defeating him. She is feeding the very structure in herself that made her vulnerable to him in the first place. She is teaching her own psyche that safety comes from control, that connection comes from strategy, that love is a game of leverage rather than an offering of the whole self. She may win the immediate battle. She may watch him unravel with something close to grim pleasure. But she will look up one day, months later, and not recognize the person staring back at her from the mirror, guarded, calculating, quietly cruel in ways she once swore she would never become. This is what I mean when I say the danger of fighting monsters. You must be exceedingly careful in the process that you do not become one. The abyss, as I have said elsewhere in my life's work, also gazes into you. This is the first road. It is tempting, and I understand its appeal completely. But it is not liberation. It is contagion. There is a second road, and it looks similar from a distance, so similar that the narcissist himself often cannot tell the difference at first, which is precisely why it works. But its internal architecture is entirely different, and this difference is everything. On this second road, the empath does not learn to withhold love as a weapon. She learns for the first time in her life to withhold love from someone who has proven, repeatedly and without ambiguity, that he does not deserve unlimited access to it. This is not manipulation. This is discernment. And discernment is a muscle the empath was never taught to build, because her entire early architecture was built on the premise that love must be given freely, constantly, without condition, or she is failing at love itself. The narcissist exploited this premise ruthlessly. The second road begins the moment the empath understands that boundaries are not the opposite of love. They are what makes love sustainable, sane, and mutual rather than extractive. On this road, the empath does not fake indifference to punish him. She cultivates genuine indifference because she has done the deeper work of no longer building her sense of worth on his approval. And this is not coldness. I want to be precise here, because coldness and detachment are so often confused, and the confusion causes tremendous suffering. Coldness is the absence of feeling. Detachment, in the sense I mean it, is the presence of feeling held at the correct distance, close enough to remain human, far enough that another person's chaos no longer becomes your own nervous system's emergency. The empath on this road still feels. She simply no longer bleeds automatically every time he wants her to. On this road, the empath stops explaining herself, not out of spite, but because she has finally understood a truth that should be carved above every door. You cannot reason a person out of a position they did not reason themselves into. The narcissist's confusion, his accusations, his rewriting of events, these do not require her testimony anymore. Her silence is not a weapon here. It is simply the sound of someone who has stopped auditioning for a jury that was never going to deliver a fair verdict. On this road, the empath studies him. Yes, studies him the way I studied the dreams and symbols of my patients, with clinical curiosity rather than emotional entanglement, not to defeat him, but to finally see him clearly, without the golden filter of early idealization or the black filter of late-stage rage. She sees the pattern. She sees the child inside the performance. And seeing this does something remarkable. It removes his power to surprise her. What no longer surprises you can no longer devastate you. This is the second road, and I tell you plainly, it is the harder of the two. It requires more discipline than revenge ever will, because revenge is hot and quick and satisfying in the moment, while this quieter transformation asks the empath to sit for a long while in the discomfort of not reacting, of not explaining, of not seeking one final acknowledgement of her pain. Because that acknowledgement, if she is honest with herself, was never coming, and the wait for it was simply another chain. Now, some of you listening will ask, is there not a place for the first road at all? Is there no use in learning his tactics, even temporarily, if only to survive the war he started? And I will not pretend the answer is a simple no. There are moments, genuine emergencies of the self, where the empath must, for a time, adopt strategies that feel foreign and hard. Going gray, offering no emotional information at all, becoming, briefly, unreadable. This is not the same as becoming a narcissist. A soldier who learns to move silently through enemy territory has not become the enemy. The distinction lies entirely in purpose and duration. Strategy used temporarily in service of escape and healing is wisdom. Strategy adopted permanently in service of power and control over another human being is the very disease you were trying to cure yourself of. Ask yourself always which one you are practicing. The body keeps no record of your intentions, but your character does. Let me tell you now what actually happens. Psychologically, inside the narcissist, when he encounters an empath who has walked this second road, because it is worth understanding, not for the satisfaction of it, though there is some, but because it will teach you something important about your own healing. He does not know what has happened to her. He only knows that the levers no longer work. He reaches for guilt, and it slides past her like water past stone. He reaches for jealousy, manufacturing a rival, and she regards the performance with something close to boredom. He reaches for the old nostalgia, the memory of the golden beginning, and she remembers it too, but now she remembers it as what it was, a carefully constructed opening act, not proof of a love that was ever safe. And in the absence of her old reactivity, something in him begins to destabilize, because his entire sense of self was built, brick by brick, on being able to produce an effect in others. Without the effect, he does not know who he is. This is often the moment such men escalate: smear campaigns, sudden proposals, threats, a rapid new relationship flaunted for her benefit, all of it noise, all of it proof that the supply line has been cut and the organism is in withdrawal. Understand this clearly. His chaos in this period is not evidence of love returning. It is evidence of hunger. And the empath, if she has walked the second road faithfully, watches this unfold with something that surprised even her the first time she felt it: pity, without the compulsion to fix it. This is one of the great signs of healing, not the absence of compassion, but compassion that no longer obligates you to self-destruct on someone else's behalf. Now, I want to turn to the deeper structure beneath all of this, because tactics and strategies, useful as they are, will only carry you so far. What is actually occurring beneath the visible drama of two people locked in a painful dance is a confrontation between the empath and her own shadow, the disowned, unintegrated part of her psyche that she projected for months or years onto the narcissist himself. This will be uncomfortable to hear, so let me say it gently, but without softening its truth. The capacity for coldness, for strategy, for withholding, for self-protection at the expense of another's comfort. This capacity exists in the empath too. It has always existed in her. It is not evil. It is simply the part of her personality she was taught from childhood was unacceptable. The part that says no, the part that protects its own boundaries fiercely, the part that can walk away without guilt. Because this part was forbidden expression, she disowned it, buried it, and then, as the unconscious always does with what is buried, she found someone who would live it out for her. The narcissist became the container for her own unlived assertiveness, her own unlived capacity for self-interest, however distorted his version of it became. This is why the bond, however painful, felt so magnetic, so impossible to simply walk away from through willpower alone. She was not only entangled with him, she was entangled with the exiled half of her own nature, wearing his face. This is the real reason the moment I described at the beginning of this speech matters so profoundly. The moment the empath stops crying and starts watching. In that moment, she is not merely observing him. She is, for the first time, meeting this disowned part of herself face to face and deciding what to do with it. Does she flee from it again, back into the old pattern of over-giving, over-explaining, over-sacrificing? Does she seize it clumsily and become its puppet, weaponizing coldness the way it was once weaponized against her? Or does she do the third, hardest, most transformative thing? Does she integrate it? Does she bring that exiled capacity for boundaries, for self-protection, for discernment, home into her own personality where it belongs, so that it no longer needs an external host to be expressed? This, and only this, is what true psychological victory looks like. Not defeating the narcissist, not even leaving him, though leaving is very often necessary. The victory is the empath reclaiming the parts of her own soul that she had exiled long before he ever arrived, parts he simply discovered vacant and moved into, the way anyone moves into an empty house. I have watched this pattern in the lives of countless people, and I have lived enough of my own life to know its texture from the inside as well. And I can tell you this with complete confidence: the individual who does this work, who reclaims the shadow rather than merely projecting it onto an opponent, defeating him, and calling it healing, becomes something the narcissist can never become himself. She becomes whole, not perfect, not without darkness. Whole, meaning she now contains consciously both her tenderness and her strength, both her generosity and her boundaries, both her capacity to love deeply and her capacity to walk away without apology when love is no longer being met with respect. This wholeness is the thing the narcissist spends his entire life performing and never achieves, because wholeness cannot be performed. It can only be lived from the inside by someone willing to look at every part of themselves without flinching. I want to speak now to the fear that arises in so many empaths at exactly this point in their healing. The fear that in learning boundaries, in learning strategy, in learning to withhold, they are betraying their own gentle nature, becoming hard, becoming, in their own private nightmare, just like him. I understand this fear. It is, in fact, evidence of something beautiful. It is evidence that your conscience is still intact, still watching, still asking the right questions. The narcissist never asks himself this question. He never lies awake wondering if he has gone too far, become too cold, hurt someone unnecessarily. The very fact that you are afraid of becoming him is itself powerful proof that you are nothing like him. But I will not let you hide behind the fear either, because fear, left unexamined, becomes its own prison, one that keeps the empath perpetually vulnerable, perpetually available, perpetually afraid to disappoint even those who have long since forfeited the right to her disappointment. There is a difference, and you must learn to feel it in your body, not just understand it in your mind, between the cruelty that seeks to wound and the boundary that simply refuses to be wounded further. One reaches outward to control another person's feelings. The other stays entirely within its own territory, asking nothing of the other person except distance. Learn this difference in your bones, and you will never again confuse healthy self-protection with the disease you are recovering from. Let me speak now of what emerges on the other side of this confrontation, because I do not want to leave you only with the war. I want to leave you with the peace that follows it, for those who walk the harder road all the way to its end. The empath who integrates rather than mimics discovers, often to her own astonishment, that her empathy has not been destroyed by this ordeal. It has been refined. Where once she felt everyone's pain indiscriminately, absorbing it as though it were her own, unable to distinguish her feelings from the feelings of whoever stood nearest to her, she now feels with far greater precision. She can sit with another person's suffering without drowning in it. She can offer compassion without offering herself as sacrifice. This is not a lesser form of empathy. It is empathy that has finally grown a spine, and an empathy with a spine can walk into far darker rooms than one without, because it knows it can walk back out again. She discovers, too, that her voice has changed, not louder necessarily, steadier. She no longer over-explains her decisions to people who were never going to accept any explanation as sufficient. She says what she means once, clearly, and lets the silence afterward do its own honest work, rather than filling every silence with anxious justification, the way she once did. This steadiness is not coldness. People who knew her before and after will tell you the warmth is still there. If anything, it is more available now, because it is no longer being drained by people who had no intention of ever reciprocating it. She discovers that solitude, which once terrified her, because for so long alone felt identical to unloved, has become something closer to sanctuary. She can sit in a quiet room with her own thoughts and feel, not the old anxious hum of, am I enough? Am I doing enough? Am I giving enough? But something calmer, something like company. This is perhaps the truest sign that the integration has taken root, when solitude stops being punishment and becomes, instead, a room she is glad to return to. And she discovers, perhaps most importantly of all, that she no longer requires the narcissist's transformation, apology, or acknowledgement in order to feel that her story has ended well. This is worth sitting with, because so many people remain chained to their former tormentors for years, even after all contact has ended, simply because they are still waiting, waiting for the apology that validates their pain, waiting for the moment he finally understands what he did, waiting for some cosmic scoreboard to show the final tally in her favor. The empath who has done the deeper work releases this waiting entirely. She understands that her healing was never actually his to complete. It was always, from the very beginning, hers alone to finish, in rooms he will never even know she entered. I want to say something now about power, because this whole subject, at its root, is a subject about power. Who holds it, who surrenders it, and how it can be reclaimed without corrupting the one who reclaims it. The narcissist's entire existence is an elaborate strategy to accumulate power over others because he has none over himself. Every manipulation, every performance, every calculated silence is an attempt to control externally what he cannot regulate internally. This is, in the end, a form of profound weakness dressed in the costume of strength. And once you see this clearly, you will find it very difficult to fear him the way you once did, because you cannot indefinitely fear a hungry ghost once you have seen how empty the house is that he haunts. True power, by contrast, the power the empath is capable of reclaiming through this entire ordeal, does not need to be exercised over another person at all. It is simply the capacity to remain yourself, fully regardless of what is done to you, said about you, or withheld from you. It is the capacity to leave a room without needing the other person's permission to do so. It is the capacity to feel enormous compassion for someone's wounding while still refusing absolutely to let that wounding continue to injure you. This kind of power cannot be taken from you once it is genuinely internalized, because it was never dependent on external circumstances to begin with. The narcissist can take your money, your time, your trust, even years of your life. He cannot take this once you have built it, because it does not live in the world he operates in at all. It lives in the part of you he was never actually capable of touching, however much it felt, during the worst of it, as though he had reached every corner of your soul. So let me return, finally, to the question I asked you at the beginning. What happens when the empath uses the narcissist's tactics against him? If she stops there, if the story ends with mimicry, with strategic coldness deployed as revenge, with silence used only to punish rather than to heal, she will win small, temporary victories and lose something far larger in the process: her own uncorrupted nature, traded piece by piece for the satisfaction of watching someone else suffer the way she once suffered. This is not liberation. It is merely changing which side of the same prison wall you stand on. But if she goes further, if she uses this confrontation not as an opportunity for vengeance, but as an opportunity for confrontation with her own shadow, if she reclaims her disowned capacity for boundaries and discernment rather than simply performing his cruelty back at him, if she lets the entire ordeal become the fire in which a more whole version of herself is finally forged, then something extraordinary occurs. She does not become the narcissist. She becomes the very thing he could never become, no matter how long he lived or how many people he consumed along the way. She becomes integrated. She becomes someone who contains both light and shadow consciously, rather than one who performs light while secretly being ruled by an unacknowledged darkness. And here is the final truth I want to leave with you, the one I consider, after a long life spent studying the depths of the human psyche to be among the most important I have ever arrived at. The people who wound us most severely are very often, without ever intending it, our most efficient teachers. Not because their cruelty was a gift, it was not, and I will never romanticize suffering as though pain itself carries some noble purpose, but because their cruelty forces a confrontation that comfort never would have forced. It drags us, however unwillingly, into the buried rooms of our own psyche that we would otherwise have spent an entire lifetime avoiding. The empath who survives this, who does the harder work of integration rather than mere retaliation, does not simply recover from what was done to her. She becomes someone the narcissist, in his emptiness, could never have imagined creating, a whole human being, tempered rather than shattered, gentle still, but no longer available for exploitation, soft still, but no longer soft in the places that required protection. If you are in the middle of this story right now, if you recognize yourself in every word I have spoken, if you are lying awake tonight replaying conversations that make less and less sense the more you examine them, if you are afraid that setting a boundary makes you cruel, if you are terrified that walking away makes you the villain of a story you never asked to be cast in, hear this clearly. You are not becoming cold by protecting yourself. You are not becoming him by refusing, finally, to be endlessly available to someone who was never available to you in return. You are not obligated to keep bleeding to prove that you are still capable of love. The task in front of you is not to become as hard as the one who hurt you. The task is to become as whole as you were always capable of becoming before the world convinced you that your softness had to be a wound rather than a strength. Take back the parts of yourself you exiled to survive him. Bring them home. Let your empathy keep its warmth, but give it at long last a spine of its own. And when you finally stand in that quiet room I described at the beginning, the room where you no longer cry, no longer explain, no longer plead, know that the silence you feel there is not coldness. It is simply the sound of a soul finally becoming whole.